None of the panels finished exactly the same time, so if you had to wait a little bit, our apologies for that. I'm sure nobody minded an extra opportunity to get a shot of coffee in there as well, but we're all back here. We're going to hear a short report from each of the sessions, and we'll also hear from Pierre Basco. He's the Director of the European Commission, DG Agriculture and Rural Development. He'll join us just for some remarks on each of the reports as well. On stage with me right now is my good friend Dave Keating. Dave's session was on climate neutral farming systems. Dave, what did you hear?
Well, in our panel, we talked about both adaptation and mitigation needs for climate neutral farming systems. So we heard about both what farmers need to do to help contribute to the EU's increased ambition now to get to 55% emissions reductions by 2030 and net zero emissions by 2050, but also what farmers are going to have to do to adapt to changing climate patterns. We had a presentation from Alan Bellward from the Joint Research Center who really painted a picture of how climate zones are going to change as a result of climate change. He told us that there's a northward migration of climate zones up to 150 kilometers every decade, and so that's going to mean a change to the type of crops that farmers are going to be growing. But he also told us about the increased digitalization to actually monitor what's happening on the ground. We talked a little bit about what citizens can do to contribute to that data gathering. Then we heard from Doris Letina, who's a Lithuanian farmer and vice president of the Young Farmers Association, and she told us how people on the ground are really changing their farming practices. And we did hear that young farmers tend to be more open to these kinds of new farming practices. Although we also talked about a lot of these farming practices that are regenerative agriculture, for instance. A lot of them are just good practices farmers should have been using all along, but it isn't that widespread yet. Then we heard from Katja Seidenschnur from Nestle, who told us a little bit more about the consumer-facing aspect of things and how you have different applications for different crops when it comes to climate-neutral farming. And then finally, we heard from Pierre Basco, who we'll also hear from here, from the European Commission, who talked a little bit about how the Common Agricultural Policy is going to be adjusted to meet that 55% emissions reduction target for 2030, and how EU money can work and help farmers and businesses have more sustainable agriculture, climate neutral agriculture. But he also pointed out that there are really big business opportunities for companies and farmers here. And so farmers and companies should be willing to also spend their own money because they will get a return.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Dave. Let's go over to Pierre. Pierre, you have the inside track in this session already. If Bob Dylan was writing your policy, he'd say these times are changing. What's changing beyond what Dave has told us, and the business opportunities? What do you want to highlight about the business opportunities here? Pierre.
Thank you, Brian. Yes, I think farmers, but I should rather say I think the land managers at large, farmers and foresters, have a key role to play, I think, in this EU climate policy. I think we heard earlier in the plenary session about the efforts that the EU needs to do to reach climate neutrality 2050. And we heard also about the contribution of the land sector. That could be the first one, I think, reaching this neutrality in 2035. And we know that according to our analysis, and in particular, I think, according to the impact assessment that have accompanied, I think, the Commission proposal for the Fit for 55 package, there is still potential for reducing emissions from livestock and from fertilizer use, and also and this with the uptake of technologies and good land practices, and I would say good, production systems. And in addition to the ones that have been discussed, I think, in this in the plenary session, I could also mention, I think, precision farming, anaerobic digestions, feed additives, breeding. So a lot of potential to reduce, I think, this level of greenhouse gas emission from the farm sector. And to this end, the Commission has also adopted a strategy for the reduction of methane emissions, and together with more horizontal actions, such as improving, and this is important, the monitoring of methane emissions from different sources. I think this methane strategy also includes action which are specific for the agricultural sector, and for instance, actions on greenhouse gas calculators, I think, for farmers. But on the other end, I think we have to recognize the fact that agriculture, together with forest, has the unique capacity to remove carbon, I think, from the atmosphere. Forests represent, I think, the biggest part of the EU sink, and this is where the highest potential lies. Afforestation, reforestation, sustainable forest management will be the main tools in this context. But for the EU grassland and cropland, which are currently representing a source of emission, the main objective should be for us, I think, to reduce the losses of carbon already stored and to increase the carbon sequestration into the soils where the current low presence of organic carbon. And for this, appropriate soil management, such as conservation, agricultural principle, agroforestry, just to name a few, are among, I think, the practices that we need to support and that we need to promote, I think, towards, I think, the farming community. And a significant contribution to the EU sink can also come from the restoration of peatland and wetland, and I think this is one of the main focus of the future CAP, and the possibility to undertake paludiculture. That means, growing crops under wet conditions. And we shouldn't forget, and this was one of the elements which was highlighted, I think, in the first panel, is that reducing emission and sequestering carbon into the soil and biomass also comes with co-benefits. Soil organic carbon makes soil more resistant, more resilient to climate change. We have heard also in this session how important it is, I think, to have resilient ecosystems for the new climate objectives. Raising water levels in drained peatlands also help with biodiversity conservation. It helps also in providing ecosystem services linked to water purification, and also it helps with flood control and drought prevention. So the new approach to farming could embrace all these practices and technologies, and I will finish by that. But clearly, it may represent an additional cost for land managers, and it may require specific support in terms of knowledge and advice. And this is where the common agricultural policy can and should play a role, and its full role in the future, in creating an enabling and supportive condition for all land managers.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Pierre, thank you so much for that. I'm joined on stage now by Tamsin Rose, who dealt with the bioeconomy panel. What did you hear?
Well, as you said, the bioeconomy panel was very lively, and the first thing we needed to do was explore exactly what we meant by it. And the message that came through from our speakers is it is a sector that has enormous potential for renewable carbon in terms of production, use, and storage. Farmers and the forestry sector need to see themselves part of the carbon cycle, going beyond the agriculture things that they normally do. But we also heard, just like the previous session, that younger generations of people working in forest and farms are more eager and willing to engage in this, more ready to have the digital tools to understand what to do. We heard from two projects that have been supporting the bioeconomy, and one of them particularly had been providing a lot of information and tools to allow people in the forestry sector particularly to understand how they could engage with it and what they do. But we heard there's a tremendous need for investment and support, policy support, to help farmers and the forestry sector to adopt this new technology and to move into it. Most importantly, I think, we talked about wood. What an extraordinary material wood is, and how it has use in the chemistry sector, the construction sector, textiles and packaging. Its potential as a substitution for fossil fuels is extraordinary, and absolutely the last thing we should be doing is burning it. We should be looking at other ways to add value in the bioeconomy. We talked a little bit about potential tensions between rules designed to protect biodiversity and environmental protection, which might push to using land less intensively, and the need to create a thriving bioeconomy where we would have more use of forestry and agricultural products. So there was some conversation there about how to square that circle. But finally, we said there's a need to reevaluate and look again at our arable land, our agriculture and forestry, and to see it as an intrinsic asset in our approach to trying to tackle climate change and meet our Fit for 55 targets.
Excellent. Tamsin, thank you to you and your panel as well. Let's go back to Pierre for a follow-up on this as well. Pierre, we tend to look quite negatively at climate change, but we hear from Tamsin there are assets there as well, things which can tangibly help us and do so at a reasonable pace. What's your take on what Tamsin has told us?
Thank you very much. I think this is extremely important, and obviously, I think for us, the bioeconomy is at the heart, I think, of the new climate objectives. I think the use of sustainably produced biomass, and I will insist on the word sustainably produced biomass, for the replacement of fossil-based products is an absolute necessity. And agriculture and forestry can help the decarbonization through the sink and by supplying biomass to develop further the bioeconomy in general and the production of biogas and biomethane, I think, in particular. But of course, and I would like to underline that, this must be coherent with other EU objectives on biodiversity and on the protection of nature. And land managers can be important actors also in this case. So we are very much convinced that a modern and sustainable bioeconomy can indeed create new economic opportunities for primary producers and rural areas, while also promoting win-win scenario for mitigation and adaptation to climate change. And this is, in this context, it is absolutely essential that we empower our farmers and our foresters in this green transition. So on the side of the Commission, we will remain, I think, very much supportive, and we will try our utmost, I think, to ensure that research and innovation work hand in hand with the future CAP to unlock this largely untapped potential of the bioeconomy sector. On research and innovation, I think we will mobilize targeted investment under the Future Horizon Europe with a budget of around 9 billion euro over the 2021-2027 programming period for work programs, partnership, missions, etc., and concerted action with the member states, the private sector, and the other stakeholders. And under the future CAP, for the first time, and I would like to emphasize that, for the first time, the bioeconomy is explicitly included under one of its EU common specific objectives. And the national strategic plan that member states, I think, will have to prepare and submit to us in a few weeks represent, in our view, a unique opportunity for the member state to design tailor-made and more result-oriented intervention in support of the bioeconomy with more subsidiarity to adapt the support that can be granted, I think, to actors on the ground, I think, depending on the local specificities and needs. And for this, we have a whole panoply, a wide range of policy tools, eco-scheme in the first pillar, the second pillar measures, the more traditional measures with investment support, training support, advisory services, etc., which will be extremely important. We have also under the future conditionality systems, we will have to also to protect farmers, will have to protect peatland and wetland. So the protection of organic carbon, I think, in the soil, which will be quite fundamental, and we will ensure a basic level of sustainability when dealing with the production of biomass or the removal of crop residues. So future CAP will be very much, I think, supportive and combined, I think, with the research and innovation policy. We do believe and we do hope that this will allow, I think, the bioeconomy sector to really change gear and develop much more significantly than what is currently the case in the EU.
Pierre, thank you. Thank you so much. And I have with me now to talk about the role of trade, Shada Islam. Shada, what did you hear?
So, Brian, this was a fascinating conversation because, the EU is a very important trading partner, has global trade connections across the world, is negotiating free trade agreements with a number of countries. And of course, what happens in Brussels, unlike in Las Vegas, doesn't stay in Brussels. What happens in Europe doesn't stay in Europe. It has ramifications for across the world. And the link between trade, climate change, agriculture is, of course, a very deep one. And so we had a very, very interesting conversation. And in fact, a lot of questions coming in about just what the EU can do. I mean, can the EU tackle this big Green Deal question on its own? It needs global alliances, global partnerships. It needs bilateral alliances and partnerships. So there's a lot of work for the EU to do in terms of climate diplomacy, I would say. And I think that came across very, very clearly. We started off with a fantastic information given by Dr. Peter Havlik, I have to say, and the information full on about how the EU's agriculture sector sector is adapting, adjusting, but also how it's changing and becoming more efficient in terms of production and technology, and also its impact on climate change. So a lot of information there, but there was a very powerful message, I would say, and I'm going to read it to you because that message really needs to be conveyed. So it was that if the EU acts alone on mitigation measures, climate change mitigation measures, part of the reduced emissions will be leaked to other countries. But concerted action across the globe would really be most beneficial for tackling the challenge of climate change. And I think that really brings us to the crux of the problem, which is that the EU can, of course, take unilateral measures or autonomous measures, but they will not have the impact we need because we're a very connected, globally interdependent world. So we had a conversation with the Canadian mission. She's the agriculture aid attaché there, Judy Geltman, and she told us about what Canada is doing. Canada, of course, being a like-minded country, but also having signed a free trade agreement with the EU, which we've all heard about because it was often in the press, and telling us also about the different initiatives that she's taking. And then we had John Clark, Director for International Relations at DG AGRI, talking about the different EU initiatives, of course, the Green Deal, going global, but also the Fork to Farm initiatives, and also a lot of questions, as you can imagine, Brian, on the carbon border adjustment tax, whether it would be WTO compatible or not. A lot of very interesting conversations. And then we had practitioners, Marcel Van Vliet, agri-trader, and we had also Angus Woods, who produces beef in Ireland. And of course, they were telling us about how sustainable their practices are becoming and how they hope that this will spread worldwide. And as I said, I think there's an optimistic note there because what happens in Brussels doesn't stay in Brussels.
Shada, thank you so much. Excellent. Pierre, we have this capacity for global leadership now. We talk about it in many dimensions. How do you see what Shada has just brought to us from this panel?
Well, we have seen in this panel that trade is very important for EU agriculture. We shouldn't forget that the EU, I think, is a net exporter. And trade does help, I think, to diversify supply and demand and contribute, I think, to the resilience and food security, I think, in the EU. And it can, in our view, also contribute to climate change mitigation, but this under the right conditions. But however, I understand that concerns were expressed also in this panel about, I think, the risk of unfair competition from abroad, I think, where there's differences in standards. And if I understood correctly, and it seemed that, they were concerned also that if the EU acts alone, we risk seeing, emission leaking. So in my view, I think one key element, I think, which is emerging from this panel and which is absolutely essential is that cooperation at bilateral and multilateral level is absolutely key, I think, in this context. And we got confirmation from various speakers. You were mentioning the Canadian ambassador, but climate change mitigation is high on the agenda of most countries in the world. And the EU is seeking commitment from international partners to become climate neutral, and the EU is building green alliances with like-minded partners to raise and to develop standards for sustainable growth. And the EU also intends to promote international standards in the relevant international bodies. Both at traders and farmers level, there are many initiatives also which have been already undertaken to make the businesses more sustainable and more climate friendly, as it has been discussed, I think, in the panel. And with the Green Deal, the Farm to Fork strategy, and the Trade Policy Review initiative, which have been put forward by the Commission, all these initiatives, offer many elements that could make our trade more sustainable. I can provide you, I think, with some example. I think the latest Commission proposal on deforestation, the new rules on due diligence, I think the review of the EU pesticide policy on import tolerances, and also, I think, what you mentioned in this reporting, I think the carbon border adjustment mechanism. But action are also taken, on a bilateral basis. And I could mention here, I think, the ongoing review of the 15-point trade and sustainable development action plan with the aim to improve the implementation and enforcement of sustainable development chapters in free trade agreement. And I will finish, I think, my intervention by recalling that on the request of the Council and the European Parliament, the Commission is also working on a report concerning the rationale and the legal feasibility of applying EU health and environmental standards to imported agri-food products, as well as identifying the concrete initiatives that we could put in place to ensure better consistency in their application. And this, obviously, and I would say, and this is a prerequisite in conformity with the WTO rules. So to conclude, I think with this mix of initiatives at private level, public level, at EU level, and at more international level, it is expected that trade can play a role and can be even, I would say, an accelerator of the transition towards more sustainability and more sustainable production methods across the globe. Thank you.
Excellent. Thanks, Pierre. Now we come to the panel which I was participating with on organics as well. And what the main theme of this turned out to be was about systemic approaches and in different sectors as well. So the systemic approach, we can't just look at one dynamic. We can't just look at climate. We can't just look at health. We can't just look at politics as well. But the levers of politics were emphasized within this as well, that we can't depend simply on an economic model which is data-driven, but we have to be consistent with the wider policy objectives as well if there's to be a realistic chance of making this work. We heard from Jørn Sanders, who emphasized the capacity for organic farming, agriculture to be of huge benefits. For example, 1,000 kilograms per year per hectare in terms of reduction capacity, and the CO2 emissions per hectare and output need to be measured. We can't measure one dynamic without doing the other. We have to get a realistic picture of what's actually going on. If the organic production happens to produce more CO2 in terms of the production which ends up on our shelves, how valuable is that in terms of climate action? But then Jørn was also talking about food waste, for example, and this is what they meant by systemic approach as well. We can produce more organic food, but we should stop wasting so much food as well. And the different dynamics of this translated throughout all the panel speakers. And yield gap was something else that was discussed quite a lot too. So one of the research gap elements that were presented was that we need more data on this. And by data, the panelists were speaking about data in terms of benchmarking farmers in organic production who are efficient at producing organic material of different types and produce which can be market-driven as well. And we had one producer who was talking about 900 farmers which they partner with and how they're using that data to analyze where they can invest in the future as well. And the other side of the data-driven approach is what consumers want. And there's an appetite for 65% of consumers are willing to participate more in the organic market. But there's the issue of standardization as well. Standards can be confusing, and that needs to be simplified. So again, building into the systemic approach as well, multi-layers and necessary to improve the climate mitigation, but also to balance out what we eat. We heard very clearly about what we eat has got to change. Less meat and many more vegetables making up part of our diet. Consequence of that, our health improves, the cost to the economy also declines as well because of healthcare costs as well, which are, as we know, substantial, not just with obesity, with cardiovascular disease, these other elements as well. So again, systemic approach, invest in organics and see a benefit translated into other costs as well. And we heard from what the European Commission about how the Commission is supporting organic production in different levels and how the farm to fork strategy, the biodiversity strategy are having a direct positive effect. But also we heard about how this is a benefit for employment, particularly for young farmers, reintroducing young farmers to the land again, and how organic farming is more appealing to women who would want to participate in that market as well. Demand-driven and research-driven as well. That was one of the key messages that we heard. Pierre, over to you.
Thank you very much. The organic sector is a very important sector for us, I think, in the transition towards sustainability, climate neutrality, resilience and competitiveness. And this is why we, as a Commission, in its Green Deal, strategy and the Farm to Fork and biodiversity strategy, has announced aspirational target of 25% of agricultural land managed under organic farming. Organic system can be very diversified, and the potential contribution in terms of mitigation is a result of complex interactions of several local factors, including soil characteristics, local climate, but also socioeconomic conditions, of farm. But I would say in general, it's acknowledged that organic farming produces fewer greenhouse gas emissions than conventional farming on a per hectare basis. And this is why expanding the agricultural area under organic farming can, in principle, produce positive effects in terms of greenhouse gas emission. But for this, we need to ensure that, and it was mentioned, by the, you mentioned it in reporting, from the panel, we need to ensure that yield levels in the organic sector are sufficiently high, and that at the same time, we tackle the issue of food waste and changes in dietary pattern. And in this context, I would like to underline that the action plan for the development of organic production that the Commission has adopted, earlier this year in March, if I'm not incorrect, this action plan has announced substantial investment in research and innovation that aims precisely at increasing organic farming yields and aims also at disseminating best practices, for example, through advisory services. Reducing food losses, food waste, rebalancing dietary pattern represent also a very important policy issues, for the Commission, and on which we are currently working. And as it has been stated in the Farm to Fork strategy, the Commission will propose legally binding targets to reduce food waste across the EU.
Okay.
And finally, I would like to conclude on that. Regarding organic farming, it is important to highlight that the combined positive effect of organic farming, in particular on biodiversity, on soil health, on animal welfare, which are also important objectives under the EU Green Deal, all these, I would say, positive effects, besides, the climate performance, should all be considered in the overall contribution of the organic farming sector, which is, as I said, an important sector for us in the transition that we are promoting. Thank you.
Pierre Basco, thank you so much for a substantial contribution, and to all our moderators as well who brought us the clarity from each of the panels too. So thank you to each and all who participated, and for those who took part in the panels as well. So let's go to our concluding remarks for today.